63rd and Western, and this is the building where the draft boards, 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago, were located here. And we rented an office in the building as a bookstore, and this is where we got into the draft board offices and removed a lot of the material, mountains of files and cards, and burned them outside. We did not endanger the building, or much less endanger the life of anybody in there or anywhere around here.
Rick, as a historian, is going to talk about, you know, the historical background to what happened.
My specialty as a historian and political writer is writing about the backlash against the left and the liberalism and the insurgent movements of the 1960s. So I've completed 4 books on the history of the right from the 50s until Ronald Reagan's election. But let me just briefly, especially for the young folks who are my age and younger, talk about the Selective Service System and what were these records that were, according to 1A service records, did not have a right to exist. What they were and why they were the object for this action. So coming out of World War II, there was military conscription. Of course, this continued as the Vietnam War ramped up, first in secret. And not only was the war profoundly mistaken and unjust and criminal, the Selective Service System was profoundly unjust. Basically, the way it worked was they had these 5-person boards, thousands of them, all over the country, volunteer boards made of kind of like local, respectable town fathers, as it were. I'm sure there were very few women. And basically all draft age men, no women, I think it was from the age of 18 to 30, were collected by the Selective Service System. And these draft boards would decide whose name got called up. And they had plenary power. So if it was an agricultural town, and they didn't want any of the tractor mechanics to go to war because they needed them for the farms, they wouldn't draft tractor mechanics. Of course, it was profoundly racist. There wasn't a single member of the Selective Service System in Mississippi who was African American. I don't know how many there were in Chicago. Since they had the power to decide not only who was classified 1A and who went, but what these different classifications were, it basically replicated the hierarchical power structures of the towns from which they came. And of course in Chicago that meant that working class, African Americans, Hispanic Americans were overwhelmingly represented. These classifications were very important too. So you would be called to a physical if your name was called. Richer kids always had ways to game the system. The wonderful, still active writer James Fallows wrote a classic article in the middle of the 70s called "What Did You Do in the Class War, Daddy?" He recalled what happened in Boston when his name was called, and he went to the draft board, and a bus came from Cambridge, Harvard, and a bus came from South Boston, the working class neighborhood, and all the kids in Harvard had doctor's notes that they got from their orthodontists, and they were pretending to be gay, or they had bone spurs. Which foot was it in? I don't know. There were all sorts of tricks. Different laxatives you could take, and this was kind of folklore that was passed along to people who thought for reasons of class that they were above all this. The kids from South Boston, they stood, they saluted, right, and they were the ones who were sent off to war. Fallows wrote a very brilliant, beautiful moral reflection on basically his guilty conscience over this. But that was the system. So they had a whole deferment system. 1A was, unrestricted. You you could go to war. 1AO was conscientious objector, non-combatant service. In other words, you would go, but you wouldn't hold a gun. There was 1O, which was conscientious objector, means you were a pacifist. And I'm sure that a lot of you could have been classified 1O. So this was completely a selfless act. There was 2S. That was the student deferment. So one of the great injustices of the system is as long as you managed to stay in college or graduate school, you could get out of the draft, as did the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, who said he had other priorities when he was draft eligible age. In late 1965, they made it even more hierarchical and unjust by instituting a system whereby only those at the bottom portion of their school's class rank, and they also had an intelligence test, would be eligible to serve. So that was a big. That was probably the opening bell of the real sort of draft resistance movement. Harvard hadn't had class ranks, and students protested to prevent the school from having it. Here in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, the students sat in at the administration building to protest the school handing over the class ranks to the Selective Service System. And they won. But, of course, that didn't help the kids who obviously were not in college.
There was a fifth classification called 4D,
Yes.
which is a ministerial exemption.
Thank you.
And I mention that because several of us in that room actually ended up in that category. I refused my 4D, and they made me a 2S, even
Yes.
while I was applying for CO status.
One-third of the people who fought in Vietnam were drafted. 2/3 were voluntary, but of course one would enter voluntary service to get privileged berths, so you wouldn't be waist deep in the big mud, right? You might go to a reserve officer training program and become an officer. You might join the Air Force. You might join the Navy. The movement of which these folks took part was dubbed in a wonderful article in the New York Review of Books in 1969, ultra resistance. People who basically put their bodies on the wheels of the draft machine to try to prevent it from operating. The first time anyone did that was in 1966 when a kid from Minnesota, whose dad was very conservative, but had 12 sons, and said that if anyone tried to induct them, he would shoot them. He broke into the local draft board in Minnesota and dumped 2 buckets of human excrement that the family had collected over the previous weeks in a file cabinet. There had been 25 such protests by the September of 1969. The Baltimore Four in 1967, who poured blood on 600 records. They included Father Philip Berrigan. Probably the most famous were the Catonsville Nine in May of 1968, which also included Philip Berrigan, joined by his brother Dan, who destroyed 378 files with the innovation of homemade napalm. That was the jelly gasoline that was used to burn the forest. The boys, was it Boylston? Boylston too. They used black paint. Gathered 10,000 files at the site of 9 Wisconsin draft boards. They represented themselves and had a very dramatic trial. They dismissed an all-star team of lawyers in order to defend themselves, which made for a very dramatic trial. And then the big kind of acceleration came basically 50 years ago this week. First was the Pasadena 3. They burned 500 files. The Silver Spring 3 in Maryland. They burned 300 files with they destroyed 300 files with both black paint and blood that our heroes managed to rescue from use of 40,000 files. And I don't know if I missed the morning, but of course they did this at the Selective Service Center at 63rd and Western, right, which represented the working class and African American South Side. Francie Duplessis Gray, who wrote this wonderful article, described it thus: the draft board actions have elements of both terrorist strike and liturgical drama. They aim to destruct and to instruct, to impede in some small way the war machine, to communicate its evil at a time when verbal and political methods have failed, by a morality play which will startle, embarrass the community, to shame the movement, to heighten militancy, perhaps to imitation. The word witness is used by members of this ultra-resistance with its historical implications of sacrifice and penance, of moral primitivism, of romantic egotism, I don't know if I agree with that, of psychological violence. The draft board actions in which the raiders demand arrest are called the stand around, to differentiate them from the acts of hit and run sabotage. They are grounded in the nonviolent mystique that a man's witness in jail can move the conscience of a nation, that can abate the violence of its rulers, and like a monk's years of passive prayer, aid to purify society. According to this mystique, the presence of the man awaiting arrest, sacrificing his freedom to witness to his moral indignation, is the ingredient that transforms sabotage into a religious and instructive act. As in tragedy and liturgy, sacrifice is conceived as the most powerful means of communication. Now, this witness took place within a broader anti-war movement that had many strains. I think one of the most useful ideas I've seen to kind of describe its historical evolution is a concept that sociologists came up with called the spiral of militancy. A lot of folks who ended up being anti-war radicals to the extent that they were willing to break laws started out often as kind of liberal idealists, believing in the stated values of the country. Often they started out as civil rights activists, right? Sometimes in Chicago with Martin Luther King, sometimes in the South. And as, of course, their ideals were frustrated, by turns they become more and more militant. They decide, kind of with each turn of the screw, that the society they believed in was rotten itself, and demanded a more radical witness. Some, of course, rejected the society and the nation entirely, but I think it's fair to say not present company. And there was also, I think, a religious version of this. When Chuck was interviewed, he talked about how he started out studying just war theory, which distinguished just wars from unjust wars, but kind of ended up under the cauldron of Vietnam and probably this spiral of militancy as thousands, and then tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands, and then actually that fall in 1969, millions, 2 million people basically stayed home from school and worked during a weekday on October 15th, 1969, that the society will not listen to rational, normal political argument. Now, many people who took this journey to the spiral of militancy did not become pacifists. They were not anti-war, they were pro-war. They were literally, after the days of rage in which a bunch of anti-war activists in Chicago decided to kind of maraud down Michigan Avenue and break windows and destroy cars, they formed an organization called the Weather Underground. And if you read their manifestos, they quite explicitly say that we are declaring war against the United States. They called it the war at home, this kind of domestic front in the international war against insurgency. And they quoted Che Guevara, one too many Vietnams. The idea is we welcome this kind of Marxist contradiction between the forces of colonial and anti-colonial, capital and socialism. one of the Weather Underground meetings was called the Wargasm. It was often, as opposed to this sort of high moral seriousness, this kind of Christian existentialism, this notion of witness, this notion of accepting in a Gandhian way arrest and the confrontation with the state. It was often quite childish, very macho, publicity hungry, and in fact violent. Of course, the Weather Underground had a bomb-making factory in Lower Manhattan. It blew up in an accident in March of 1970. They had been planning extremely militant bombings, including one at a police station in Detroit. One of our own local activists, who I won't name, was never caught, but he was involved in planning for a bombing that was to blow up a police station. The bomb didn't go off. It probably would have taken a lot of collateral damage, or a restaurant next door that was actually frequented by a lot of African American patrons. This is very different, right? And not only was this nonviolent moral witness kind of a very different kind of moral matrix, it was often much more efficacious. It was very pragmatic. It was very utilitarian. Once these records were gone, it took weeks or months to reassemble them, right? Now, I'm not going to say that nonviolent protest is always more efficacious than violent protests. I recently went to a exhibit on Stonewall at the New York Public Library, and it's fascinating. It's a totally domesticated thing now. We love Stonewall. Everyone around the world is, recognizing the 50th anniversary of Stonewall 50 years ago this summer. Basically, the patrons of this mafia-owned gay bar, fought back against a raid by the police. And when I say fought back, they locked the cops inside and threatened to burn it down. The folks we're honoring here today obviously come out of a tradition of moral witness in which that sort of kind of spontaneous kind of street fighting is not really what the story is about. I'll just end by quoting Gray one more time. I won't talk about the trial. Actually, I'll just mention one thing from the trial. And I won't talk about their statement too, which I found really fascinating, in that it was this kind of 360-degree kind of critique of the economics of society, the power dynamics in society. It wasn't just this terrible wars going on here, it's about how it's distracting from the struggle for justice at home. At their trial, in 1970, the judge was quoted in the New York Times. He said, "In over 25 years of experience as a judge, I have never experienced anything such as this court has gone through here." I hope we can hear more about that. The defendants used every tactic that could be attempted, playing to the public to encourage others to carry on and carry out the same objectives. Again, this is the difference between, the standing around and waiting to be arrested, so you can actually make that sort of public witness in the courtroom and running away underground. The judge said it is only a step, you remember this? From burning draft records to burning buildings, right? Which was obviously utter horseshit in the case of these fellows. So Chuck in his interview, I don't know if it was the person interviewing him, she was off screen, he was off screen, pointed out that their allies, maybe it was Joe and Betty, brought flowers to the prison workers to assure them of these prisoners' peaceful intent, and that their life and property weren't in danger, and that they would have nothing to fear. Compare this to, the Weather Underground, the kids who took over the administration building at Cornell University, and appeared in the newspapers the next day with rifle bandoliers around their chests. At a time in which, this is one of my favorite 60s stories, Scarsdale, New York, was kind of a rich suburban high school. High school students were in the woods studying guerrilla tactics, because they wanted to be revolutionaries too. With that, I'll end with a joke. We're here to honor the Chicago 15. Have any of you guys heard about the Indianapolis 500? They're innocent, every last one of them. Thank you.
I want to comment just in response to that. I remember talking to someone one time about high school reunions. And he said, I never went to my high school, my 10-year high school reunion, because he said there were 8 of us, 8 of my friends and I that were really close friends, and the other 7 were all killed in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And he said, so there was nothing for me to go back to.
And somehow I don't think that probably wasn't Wilmette, Illinois high school, or New Trier,
I mean, we can imagine it, the older ones of us here, but the younger people, to imagine that all of your friends from high school were all killed in the war.
or come back addicted to heroin,
Yeah.
or come back maimed, or come back with PTSD.
And the other thing that I just want to mention is the Chicago 15, as far as I know, but we're talking about 300 draft files and 378 draft files and 119 draft files, and then it goes to 40,000 draft
Yes.
files with the Chicago 15. And I don't know if that was, I think that was the second biggest.
There was one that was
ever.
bigger, yeah.
It was the
New
one,
York.
the one in New York, I think. But,
Yeah.
but it was much more than symbolic
Yes.
at that point. The others were wonderful and they were symbolic and they, affected a certain number of people, but this really shut
Yes.
down, as I understand it. I think it was either 32 or 34 draft boards.
I was intrigued by and I don't remember that statement from the judge during our trial, but about next would be a building. And it's very interesting because I don't think people realize our action was supposed to take place in Detroit.
Yeah.
And because the building, Cadillac Tower, I think it was, had an armed guard. And I don't know, a month before our action, we moved to Chicago because the possibility of injuring anybody in our action, which would have been a possibility in Detroit.
Right.
So we were in
That's an interesting contrast to the whole political culture now. There was no guard, right?
Right.
You guys had an apartment in the building or something?
yeah.
Store.
Yeah, the bookstore, right, yeah.
My bookstore.
Right, and today we live in such a heightened state of existential panic regarding all sorts of threats, right? It's inconceivable now. It's just one way that society has changed profoundly.
I'm Thom Clark. I was a member of an action 2 years after this one in Evanston called The Four of Us. And we are 2 former seminarians, 1 former nun, and a Loyola student leader. We had gotten to know each other through the Loyola Kent State strike activities. And consistent with today's rundown of stuff, I very much remember as a senior in high school at Quigley North studying and doing a speech for my senior class project on the just war theory and why, you know, just barely Vietnam was qualifying. And within 2 years, I'm doing a hunger fast, and I'm involved with the Kent State strike. I mean, you're right about '68 being this emotional time, and I was reflecting for a moment before I talk about our story a little bit that, you know, maybe this is part of what we're going through psychically as a nation now. We had a fair amount of paranoia around our action, which I'll get into in a moment, because we assumed the U.S. Army and others were watching us. We knew about the Red Squad, although we didn't know how much they were already watching us or had a file on some of us. So that was very much in the air, and I wonder if part of our wondering what to do next with the current regime is a similar kind of we're frustrated and angry but don't know what to do. And I'll just leave that there because I think that's the best way I can relate how we were feeling emotionally back in '68 with all the world events and trying to figure out how to somehow stop the gears by whatever means, and to do it more than just symbolically, to try to actually stop the gears somehow, if only temporarily. So the 4 of us very much learned from the collected Catholic left actions. That's how we kind of were referring things at the time. And post Days of Rage, we were very much reacting to the Weather Underground and what we saw as terrorist activities on the part of the peace movement. And that was not going to change hearts and minds. It was going to terrorize other Americans whose sons were going off to war, and that was not what we thought would change the dynamic. So we very much reverted to what many in the movement thought was an archaic action to emulate somewhat Cantonsville, but also picking up very much on what the Chicago 15 had been through just 2 years before, and how we plotted the liturgy, if you will, of our action, which was that we cased out a safe place that didn't have guards. We arrived and tried our best to assure the single clerk there that we weren't going to do anything to her, although she was terrorized. In fact, we had to show her how to call the police because she wasn't sure what to do after we had poured blood on her file.
Which is just amazing. They didn't train the clerks at these places that this might happen.
Security precautions.
There are all sorts of other little aspects of how we cased the place and how we acted that day, and read the book next year that I'm working on now, and certainly this conference is urging me to go forward to finish. But one of the major strategic things we picked up on was a pretty keen sense of use of media. We brought 2 reporters with us. We were at page 3 of the Sun-Times the next morning and the front page of the Loyola Phoenix. We had a very keen sense of speaking to our audience, which was Loyola students and the families and households in Evanston and Skokie, from whose draft board we were destroying things. And so a lot of our activities post-action was not so much because we wanted to be in the NCR, National Catholic Reporter, nationally, but because we were trying to see a flavor of a story into other influential audiences. And so that we had, I think, important narrative elements built into how we did the action, to how we stood around, what we said in the draft board, which later became testimony in court, you know, things like the Beatitudes and the Our Father got re-recited in the courtroom because it was part of what was said in the draft board, and it was recited by a prosecution witness who happened to be a Sun-Times reporter we brought along with us. So there are lots of things in the first few days of the trial, and probably the key legal advice from the Chicago 15 experience was from Frank Oliver, who on the morning of our arraignment, and very high bails were being set that we later got reduced, he's saying, now you need to know, don't hire a bunch of lawyers, which none of us could afford to do anyway. You should all defend yourselves, because that way you will get to do some stuff in the courtroom. And ultimately, over the summer of lots of street activities and teach-ins and other things like that, we in fact assembled a legal strategy that involved 3 of us going pro se. We had to fight for that right, but we won. And the 4th member of the group did have an attorney, so we had an attorney at the table. But quite frankly, he kind of took a back seat. until later in the trial when the grandfatherly judge kind of woke up to what we were getting away with and began to clamp down a bit. Jim Douglas, who some of you know, almost got arrested at our trial when we moved into that part of trying to put the war on trial. We've been through our character witnesses, which were probably the most important part of our testimony, was having parents and pastors, and in my case, a friend from high school in full Marine dress who had done Vietnam time come and in a very quiet, soft voice, didn't do any of the testimony. I had practiced with him, but his mere presence, we think, turned some of the jury because of his simple, straightforward answers in his full Marine dress. I mean, it was, we had powerful testimony as far as we were able to get away with it. And later, to bring the narrative quickly to a close, we got 1-year sentences at a time when even individual resistors were still getting far more. These guys are getting 2 5-year sentences just 2 years before. We were ready to serve our time, and yet we had law students from Northwestern say, no, you have an appeal case here. And ultimately, the appellate court in this district ruled that there had been a violation of First Amendment rights by the way the indictment had been written. Ironically, language that our jury had picked up on. It was the reason that they acquitted us of 3 of the 4 counts that we've been charged with. So rather uniquely in the Catholic left, we actually succeeded, I think, in a large way in putting the war on trial, and the war lost, at least for a moment. And 500 men from Skokie and Evanston didn't go to war because they could not reconstruct those files even in 6 months. And 9 months later, the clerk was still complaining, I can't get to my files. So it was a good piece of theater, I think, even though we couldn't do everything we wanted to. We probably got more done than most trials of this kind have been able to up until that point. And we ultimately ended up not serving that much time, although all of us went on into other pursuits. My late colleague Johnny Baranski did several other actions, some publicly acknowledged, some not, where indeed many more files were destroyed and the war machine was mightily interrupted.
I'm not much younger than you all. I was 10 in '68, and my dear mom, who at age 12 had lost her 19-year-old brother in the Second World War and was still grieving profoundly during Vietnam. And I grew up in Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, White Folks Bay, as I learned it was called when I went off to school. Very Republican suburb, and my mom and dad were among the few who, as the war went on, became increasingly against the Vietnam War. And in their social group, that was unheard of. And it was actions like you all, as practicing Catholics who were very concerned about social justice. I really believe that one of the reasons my mom took me to my first protest at age 10 at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee was because she was inspired and wanted, as a suburban housewife, felt she had to do something. So I just want to thank you all. The reverberations were profound.